In a previous newsletter, we addressed patient flow and patient journeys, the differences, and how they can be used in developing strategies and tactics in the pharmaceutical industry. A few of our readers came back to us requesting more information on how we can actually populate the patient flows and the patient journeys, which this particular video will address. Here we see the patient flow, which we had used in our previous newsletter. One source of data to try to get information on how many patients actually get biologic X or biologic Y or chemo A or chemo B is sales data. The challenge, however, with sales data is that it is difficult to isolate the usage of a chemotherapy in one particular cancer indication. Here are some sources that can be used in order to obtain patient flow data. Firstly, some diseases in some countries have registries. For example, every time a hospital would diagnose a patient with HIV or with a certain type of cancer, they would need to register this particular patient. So that data is sometimes available. Unfortunately, sometimes it takes a few years for the Ministry of Health to gather this data and actually share it in the companies that might be interested in that. Global epidemiology data sources can also be used, potentially adapting them a little bit to the specifics that we know about certain diseases. For example, you might obtain some global data on the prevalence of lung cancer, which could be slightly different according to the countries. But then also, if you're looking at the patients who would be eligible for example, EGFR wild type or EGFR mutated drugs, you might actually know that Asian populations have about 30% overexpressing the EGFR biomarker versus the white male Caucasian population overexpressing about 10% of the population overexpressing that particular biomarker. So you would need to adapt that. Another source of data could be pathologist biomarker diagnostic data. Can we collaborate with the companies providing kits to the pathologists to actually identify how many tests had been done? Sales reps should probably also be trained to obtain account level data. For example, for those diseases treated in the hospitals, they might be able to talk to nurses, they might be able to talk to hospital pharmacists in order to find out how many patients typically they see at a certain point in time. Medical audits is market research that is actually done with prescribers, HCPs. So typically prescribers actually write down during a particular month which patients they have seen, what they have prescribed, etc. Nurse diaries can also be used in order to find out which treatments have been applied. Advisory boards can serve the purpose of getting key opinion leader input to what are the treatments that they see being used in particular countries, what is the percentage of diagnostic, what is the compliance, etc., etc. If you have a therapy that needs to be up titrated, you can also analyze the sales of low dose versus high dose, which gives you insights on how many patients actually started the therapy versus how many were able to comply. In some countries, the insurance companies or the sick funds are actually willing to share data on what they see, and that can also be quite useful to get real world data. Patients sometimes comply and adhere to therapy, sometimes they don't, so patient-based market research can also be used. And a very final validity check can be used, which is to actually do bottom-up and top-down analysis. You start with the epidemiology, then you see which patients are diagnosed, which patients are treated, etc. And then you can compare that with the prescriptions that you see that you're getting. And very often you find out that there is a big gap between what you find out from the top, the epidemiology, and the sales that you're getting. And then sometimes people sort of throw the whole thing away saying, well, listen, this must be wrong somehow. I would see this more of an opportunity to say, well, what are the things that we don't know about? Do we know about compliance? Do we know about diagnostic rates? Do we know about treatment rates? What is the adherence to standard of care, etc.? Until you're able to pretty much match the sales that you're seeing versus the epidemiology that you're seeing coming up. So these are all sources. Not one single source is the best one. I think what we have to try to do is to gather data using all of these particular sources. Obtaining data on the patient journey is harder. Firstly, because it's much more qualitative. Do you treat a patient with product X or do you diagnose Y? And secondly, also, often patient journeys are not linear. They tend to be iterative. A patient goes to a prescriber, then gets a diagnostic, goes back to that same prescriber to get another diagnostic, etc., etc., etc. How can we find out about these particular patient journeys? Well, one key way to do this is really to observe what is going on, for example, in the hospitals. Medical science liaisons, sales reps can observe what is going on. They can talk to HCPs, they can talk to nurses. You can gain also inputs from the ad boards. Payers might be willing to share some of the data as to how patients go through a particular journey. And finally, key accounts may be able to get insights also from these payer structures. One of the main challenges here is how do you actually ask these questions? If you ask a closed question, such as, do you test biomarker X or do you fight for funding for your patient Y, you may very well get some unreal answers. One of the key things is to ensure that we're asking these questions in a very open way. Probably a question such as, what is your attitude towards biomarker testing? Which patient profiles are suitable for this particular therapy? Populating a patient journey is hence a little bit more challenging than populating a patient flow, which is rather quantitative. Having then gathered patient flow data, patient journeys, stakeholder maps, beliefs and behavior analysis, competitive foresight, and a number of other inputs, we are then able to define the strategy which will relate to where to play and how to win. Ultimately, through the definition of certain objectives, the medical tactics, the commercial tactics, and the access tactics will be defined. And we'll talk about that in a further newsletter.